In this video, we're going to be looking at how an ecosystem is structured, and this would include some of the interactions as well between the different organisms and perhaps with their environment, how an organism might be adapted to suit their environment, and then finally looking at sampling, which is how we can use this technique to figure out some of the distribution and population sizes in the ecosystem. So let's first of all start with the structure of the ecosystem. So in this picture here, you can see there are three groups of shapes, and basically I'm saying that these are three different species of organisms. We've got the circle species, the square species, and the triangle species. So what I mean by that is that because all of the organisms within this group here are the same, so the same species, we refer to this as a population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species living together in the same environment. So as you can see here, we've got three different populations. We've got the circle population, the square population, and the triangle population. Now altogether, with all of these different species or all of these different populations living together, we know that there are going to be some kind of interactions between all of them. Okay, and we're going to look at some of these interactions shortly. But this group here is referred to as a community. So a community is where we got different species interacting together in the same environment. Now we know that there will be some interactions between the different populations. So for example, between these two, or between these two, or between these two. So these interactions are referred to as biotic factors. So bio meaning living, so biotic factors are referring to interactions between different organisms, how one species or one population can affect another population. So there are three main factors here. First off, we have competition. So two species or two populations might be competing for the same thing. Secondly, we have predation. So a population of prey might be hunted by a population of predators. So in the next video, we're going to look a little bit more about the predator and prey relationships. And finally, we got pathogens, which will cause diseases. So even though we say disease is a condition, because it's caused by pathogens, which are living microorganisms that can cause the disease, is still considered as a biotic factor. So for example, a new pathogen, which is, let's say, a new species of bacteria in the ecosystem, could then cause some of the other species to die. So these are the three biotic factors. So in terms of competition, it's important that you need to be able to say or name some examples of resources that organisms might compete for. So something that both animals and plants and actually all organisms would compete for would be water. It's because everything needs water to survive. It's essential for forming lots of different chemical reactions in the body, etc. For animals, they would compete for mates to reproduce with. They would compete for food because they need, obviously food to survive, and they may compete for territory as well if they are a particularly territorial animal. For plants, they would definitely compete for light as well for photosynthesis. So for example, taller plants might be able to have more access to more light, so therefore more photosynthesis can occur. In the soil, apart from water, they would also compete for minerals to ensure they can actually grow healthily, and perhaps they might also compete for pollinators. So this can be done through, for example, specific adaptations that the plants have. For example, nectar that can give off a sweet smell to attract the pollinators, or perhaps brightly colored petals. We'll talk about adaptations later on. So as mentioned previously, we know that there will be some biotic factors, interactions between different populations as illustrated here. So I mentioned the three different examples of biotic factors, and that all happens within a community, which is when all of the different species or the different populations actually interact in the same area. Now, even though that we say the living organisms would interact with each other, there will also be certain interactions with their environment, which are the non-living factors. They are called abiotic factors. So things like sunlight or the amount of light available, especially affecting plants. This could be about the pH of the soil or pH in the water, if they're especially for aquatic organisms. The temperature in the environment and the availability of water. Perhaps it could be other things like availability of oxygen or carbon dioxide. Anything that is in a living thing that affects a living population would be considered as an abiotic factor. So as we mentioned earlier with the competition between different organisms, sometimes they might be competing for some of these resources which are abiotic factors as well. So when we consider all of these things, how living things can interact with each other, and especially how the abiotic factors might interact with the living factors, the biotic factors, or the organisms, this whole concept is now called an ecosystem. So by definition, ecosystem means the interactions of the living organisms with their environment, which includes the abiotic factors or their habitat. So it's important that in the exams you're able to actually define what these keywords might mean. So we say that actually a lot of these interactions, you can see that can be quite complex, and there are lots of different interactions, and when one population dies, for example, it could have a knock-on effect on other populations. This is what we mean by interdependence. So finally, let's look at adaptation for this part. So the types of questions you get asked, it could be that they give you an organism and they will have a label diagram of the organism and tells you briefly like what kind of habitat they live in, and then you're expected to use the picture provided and the information provided to try and explain some of the adaptations that they might have to help them survive their environment. Other types of questions would be that they say, for example, this plant is have this particular structure. Name the type of adaptation as shown by this particular structure. So there are 3 types of adaptations. First of all, it could be a structural adaptation. So this refers to any kind of physical adaptations that they might have. So it could be the thickness of their fur, or perhaps that, certain plants like the cactus can have spikes for leaves instead. So these are physical things that we can see how they might help them survive. Another type will be functional. So this is usually referring to more internal conditions. So this is referring to any perhaps biochemical reactions or metabolic reactions that happens within the body. So for example, camels they live in the desert, and they have a fat hump basically on the back which stores fat. And the idea is that the fat can be broken down to release water inside the body. So that's a functional adaptation instead of structural. And the third type is a behavioral adaptation. So as the name implies, is how the organism might behave. So for example, penguins in the cold climates, they would huddle together to basically share their body heat and to keep themselves warm. So that's a behavioral adaptation. Or for a lizard or a turtle that lies flat on the surface of a rock, or perhaps if they're burrowing underground in the shades to avoid the heat. These are all behavioral adaptations. So remember that you're expected to be able to name or classify the different adaptations into these 3 types. So in particular, extremophiles would be a particular example of organisms that have very special adaptations to allow them to live in extreme environments. So these could be examples of that would be hot springs, like near the volcanic grounds, or perhaps they might be living in very salty water, or perhaps they're living in deep sea environments. So normal organisms will not have the correct adaptations to survive in those environments. So those that live in these environments are called extremophiles. So this is the structure of the ecosystem, and also what are some of the interactions between them, which we can also refer to as interdependence. So now we're going to have a look at sampling, which is a way of how humans can study how these organisms are distributed, and in terms of how do we figure out the population sizes. So we can have 2 different types of sampling. One is called random sampling. So the concept is that if I want to figure out the population size of a species, then I can use random sampling to do this. So for example, that this is an area in the park, and we are looking at trying to sample and look at and estimate the population size of this particular flower. Now, obviously in this picture, it's quite easy to just count them up, but imagine in a big area, it'll be a lot more difficult to do. So we need two particular types of equipment. First of all, we need tape measure to actually measure out, saying that this is the area that we're going to look at. So I've put my two tape measures down, one on the x-axis and one as the y-axis. I can use a random number generator to get some random coordinates. So essentially I can almost imaginary cut up this area into different coordinates and different squares, and then use the random coordinates to place what we call a frame quadrat down, and I can basically count how many plants are found within that quadrat. So let's say 3, 5. So I could go, so that's 0, then I'll go 1, 2, and 3, and then go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can place my quadrat down there and then count how many plants I can find, let's say a particular species of dandelions in that quadrat, in that particular coordinate. Then I write the results down and I repeat the process at a different coordinate until I get enough samples across the whole area. So let's say 10 samples, and then I can get a mean population size per quadrat area. So let's say if this is a 1 meter squared quadrat, then I times that by 400 to figure out a 400 meter squared area. What is the rough estimation of the population size? So it's really important that we do not just throw the quadrat randomly, because there is going to be bias. So the key thing to remember is that you need to use a random number generator and to get random coordinates to place my quadrat down, and the whole point is to avoid bias. In order to get more accurate results is you want to have a large sample size. So for example, instead of doing just taking 5 samples of an area, you might want to take 10 or 15 samples of quadrats instead. So the larger sample size, the more accurate your results would be. So these are some of the examples of questions that they may ask you in an exam. So the other type of sampling is called systematic. So it's very different to random sampling in the sense that it's no longer random. I'm going to be taking quadrat samples at regular intervals. So this time, for example, I've got a grass area, and what we then do is, again, we're still using a tape measure and a quadrat, and this time I only really need one tape measure. And so let's say, for example, here's a very tall tree, and I've got lots and different types of dandelions going across the field like this. So I lay down a tape measure going from the base of the tree all the way out towards the field. And what I want to do is to find out how the dandelion's distribution might change as I move away from the tree. And what we then do is to place, again, with using the quadrat, but then instead of doing it randomly, I'm going to place it at regular intervals. So for example, at every 5 centimeters or every 10 centimeters, I place the quadrat down like this, count how many dandelions there are in the area before moving on to the next 5, for example, and then count it again, and then move on 5 meters onwards or 10 meters onwards. So it's about doing it at regular intervals and see if there's any particular changes to the distribution of the species. And the key concept there is, if I do see a change in the distribution, the question is what is causing that change. So it could be, for example, an abiotic factor that is influencing that distribution. It could be, for example, the amount of light the dandelions get as they move away from the tree, or the amount of water or minerals they get, or that they get from the soil as we move from one area to another. So systematic sampling is good for looking at the distribution of organisms instead of the population. So again, similar to the random sampling bit, if I wanted to increase the accuracy, is I would do it at shorter intervals. So let's say rather than every 10 meters, I might do it for every 5 meters instead. So smaller intervals means more accurate results. So to summarize, we know that systematic sampling is for finding out the distribution of an organism. To do so, we would take a sample at regular intervals along the tape measure, which is also called a transect sometimes. And if we measure or take a measurement at small intervals, I would increase the accuracy. So that is sampling. One thing that I probably should have mentioned earlier is for the random sampling one, remember we are putting the quadrat at random coordinates, and that would mean that if I place the quadrat let's say here, and there are no plants within the quadrat, or at least none of the species I'm sampling for, I still have to record that data as 0. So that is still completely valid. It just means that there isn't anything there. And when you're trying to count or trying to estimate the population, that is a valid point. So the point of the random coordinates is that you're not going to deliberately try and choose and put a quadrat somewhere that has lots and lots of that particular species. You're going to do it randomly at different areas, even if it meant that there isn't anything there. So that's a really important point in random sampling. There is a required practical on sampling, so make sure that you study up on this one as well. So that is the overview of the structure of an ecosystem and their interactions.